July 9th, 1357. 5:31 in the morning. On the banks of the Vltava River in Prague, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV lays the first stone of a bridge designed by his master builder, a young architect named Petr Parléř. The stone is Bohemian sandstone. The mortar is hydraulic lime. The astrologers have picked the moment. 45 years later, the bridge is finished. 668 years later, in 2026, that same bridge still stands. Roughly 30,000 people walk across it on a peak day. It has survived 4 catastrophic floods, including the 2002 disaster, the worst Vltava flooding in 5 centuries. Parléř Bridge is older than most of the borders that define modern Europe, and it is still load-bearing. Now compare that to a modern American bridge. Average age, 47 years. 45% are already past their 50-year design life. About 42,000 are rated in poor condition. Today we're going to dig into how medieval builders did it, the geometry that turned stone into something tougher than steel, the mortar that healed itself when it cracked, and the foundations that defeated the river itself. Petr Parléř's bridge in Prague was not unique. Across medieval Europe, between roughly the year 1100 and the year 1400, builders threw up dozens of stone bridges that are still standing and still carrying load today. The Pont Valentré in Caen, France, was started on June 17, 1308, opened to traffic in 1350, and finally finished in 1378, a 70-year build. 6 Gothic arches and 3 fortified towers more than 130 feet, 40 metres above the Lot River. Walked daily. 718 years old in 2026. Old London Bridge was built between 1176 and 1209, 33 years from start to finish. 19 stone arches, about 26 feet, 8 metres wide. It carried the City of London across the Thames for 622 years. It was not torn down because it failed. It was torn down in 1831 because it was too narrow for the traffic the city had grown into. The records survive. Britannica's entry on Old London Bridge rests on surviving guild and municipal accounts. The city of Florence rebuilt the Ponte Vecchio in 1345 after the Great Flood of 1333. An Avignon bridge-building brotherhood raised the funds for the masons of the Pont Saint-Benezet. These bridges were not legends. They were infrastructure designed by people who knew the river better than the river knew itself, and who built for a horizon they would never live to see. To understand how Petr Parléř and his contemporaries pulled this off, you have to start with what was already standing when they started. By the year 1100, every major river city in Europe sat downstream of Roman engineering. The Pont du Gard in southern France had been standing for over 1,000 years. The Roman bridge at Alcantara in Spain, completed by the engineer Caius Julius Caesar in the year 106 AD, was still in use under medieval Castilian kings. The lime kilns the Romans had used to burn limestone for hydraulic mortar had never gone cold. They were still being fired in monastery yards in northern France, in Bohemia, and in the Po Valley. The kilns were inherited. The recipe was inherited. The principle of the arch was inherited. What the medieval builders added was scale. The Cistercian order alone operated more than 700 abbey complexes across Europe by the year 1300, every one of them with masonry knowledge, kiln operations, and stone-cutting workshops. The cathedral building boom that produced Chartres, Reims, Cologne, and Wells trained generations of master masons who could move from a cathedral apse to a bridge pier without retraining a single craftsman. So when Charles IV picked up his quill in 1357 and ordered a stone bridge across the Vltava, he was not commissioning a miracle. He was sending an order down a centuries-old supply chain of lime kilns, quarries, and masons that had been running across Europe since Roman times. The infrastructure was already there. It was perfect for what came next. The most basic thing a medieval bridge builder did was lay an arch. A voussoir is one of the wedge-shaped stones that make up an arch. Each wedge pushes against the wedges next to it. The harder the load presses down, the harder the stones lock together. No nail, no clamp, no glue, no internal skeleton. The stones hold each other up by leaning into each other. This works because of a single property of stone. It is many times stronger in compression than in tension, typically 10 to 30 times depending on the stone. The arch converts the weight of carts, of people, and of 3 feet, about a metre, of standing snow into pure horizontal compression that pushes outward into the abutments at each end of the bridge. Cambridge engineer Jacques Heyman published the canonical analysis of this principle in 1966. An arch is stable, he wrote, as long as a thrust line can be drawn entirely within the masonry. No tension means no rebar required. No rebar means nothing inside the structure can ever rust. That last sentence is the entire reason these bridges have outlived steel. Geometry, though, was only the beginning. The second layer of the system was the mortar. Hydraulic lime is a mortar made by burning limestone, mixing it with water and waiting. It hardens slowly over years, and it keeps getting stronger as it ages. Mix in a pozzolan, volcanic ash or finely crushed brick that reacts with the lime, and you get a mortar that hardens underwater and keeps gaining strength for centuries. The Klona Institute at the Czech Technical University in Prague has run a multi-year research program on the original 1357-era binder used in Charles Bridge. Their thermogravimetric analysis confirmed a high hydraulicity binder, behaving chemically much like modern Portland cement, but mixed and cured very differently. In 2010, the Faculty of Science at Charles University re-examined the same mortar and concluded the binder is a hydraulically binding lime with no organic additives detected in their samples. An earlier 2008 analysis at the University of Chemistry and Technology in Prague had claimed to find protein traces supporting the old folk tale about egg yolks. The two studies disagree. The most recent peer-reviewed analysis sided with the chemistry, not the legend. Modern Portland cement reaches roughly 99% of its design strength in 28 days. After that, gains are minor. The medieval mortar starts at near zero strength on the day it is laid and is still gaining strength 100 years later. It is the rare building material that gets better with age. The third layer of the system was the foundation. A cofferdam is a ring of wooden poles driven into the riverbed. Once it is sealed, the water inside is bailed out, and the masons build the bridge's foot on the dry stone underneath. Old London Bridge, completed in 1209 under the master builder Peter de Colchurch, used 19 of these foundation islands. Each cofferdam was built from oak or elm logs driven vertically into the bed of the Thames in a ring roughly 50 feet, 15 metres across. The seam between logs was packed with clay and reinforced with sand. Once the ring was watertight, labourers baled the inside dry, drove additional timber piles into the exposed riverbed, lashed an oak grate of beams across the pile heads, weighted the grate with stones connected by wrought iron bars, and only then began laying masonry. The pier was built on a wooden grate sitting on dozens of timber piles driven into bedrock. Each pier was further protected by a starling, a wider boat-shaped collar of timber and stone that broke the current before it ever reached the masonry. Once the bridge rose above the water, the starling stayed where it was, taking the brunt of every flood for the next 600 years. But getting a foundation into the river was only half the problem. The other half was what scientists in the 21st century only recently solved. In January 2023, a research team at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, led by Admir Masic, with then doctoral student Linda Seymour as first author, published a paper in the journal Science Advances. They had been pulling chunks of 2,000-year-old Roman concrete out of an archaeological site at Privernum in central Italy and looking at them under an electron microscope. Inside the cured mortar, they kept finding small white particles, lime clasts, that earlier researchers had assumed were just sloppy mixing. A lime clast is a small unmixed lump of lime trapped inside the mortar. If a crack ever opens and water reaches the clast, the lime dissolves and crystallizes back as new rock that fills the crack. Masic's team thought differently from earlier researchers. They remade the recipe with quicklime instead of slaked lime, hot the way the Romans did. They cracked the cured samples. They poured water into the cracks. 2 weeks later, the cracks were sealed. Identical samples made without quicklime never sealed at all. Think about what this study reveals. The Romans were not building badly. They were embedding a self-healing mechanism into the stone. And the medieval bridge builders who walked across Roman aqueducts on their way to work, who fired the same lime kilns and cured the same hydraulic mortars, inherited the same chemistry. They did not need to understand the molecular reaction. They needed to keep the recipe alive. For more than 1,000 years, that is exactly what they did. The fourth layer of the system was human. None of this chemistry would have mattered without the people who carried it. The medieval bridge tradition was held together by a small number of named master builders working inside an institutional system that transmitted skill across generations. Petr Parléř was 23 years old when Charles IV summoned him to Prague in 1356, fresh from training in his family's workshop at Schwäbisch Gmünd in southern Germany. The emperor put him in charge of St. Vitus Cathedral first. The next year, he handed him the bridge as well. Peter de Colchurch, the priest-architect of Old London Bridge, spent the last 29 years of his life on a single bridge and was buried in the chapel he built on the bridge itself. The institutional layer behind these men was not a single guild, but a network of overlapping institutions. Cathedral lodges trained the master masons. Monastic chapters, Cistercian, Benedictine, Cluniac, funded the kilns and quarries. And around specific bridge projects, like the Pont Saint-Bénézet at Avignon, bridge-building confraternities raised the money to pay the crews. Tradition names Saint-Bénézet himself, the Avignon Shepherd Saint, as the founder of a 12th century bridge brotherhood. Modern scholars now doubt that a single Europe-wide order ever existed, but the Avignon Brotherhood that funded his bridge clearly did. The records of its tolls, arms, and repair accounts survive in archives across southern France. This was not a craftsman with a clever idea. This was a continent-wide tradition of monastic, civic, and craft institutions converging around any project ambitious enough to need them, and trusted with rivers that emperors needed crossed. The fifth layer of the system was the craft itself. The skill that separated a bridge that lasted from a bridge that washed away was the cutwater. A cutwater is the pointed nose on the upstream side of a bridge pier. It splits the current and throws ice and debris off to the sides instead of letting them slam into the pier. Every one of Petr Parléř's 15 piers on Charles Bridge has one. In cold climates, the cutwater is also sloped at an angle so that current-pushing partly submerged ice tends to lift the flow upward and shear it apart against the wedge before it can hit the pier face. This matters because of a phenomenon called scour, what the river does when it digs a hole in the riverbed at the foot of a bridge pier. Scour is the leading cause of bridge failure in the United States. An analysis cited by the Federal Highway Administration found that scour caused 60% of recorded US bridge failures between 1966 and 2005. The medieval cutwater is the only successful long-term defense against scour ever invented. Modern engineers still use them. But the cutwater only works if the stones on the upstream face fit together so tightly that no current can pry between them. Charles Bridge sandstone blocks were dressed by hand and fitted so tightly that the mortar between them served not as a structural binder, but as a gasket against water intrusion. The river found nothing to grip. The sixth layer of the system was where the stone came from. Every medieval bridge that survived had three things going for it that a modern bridge does not. First, the stone was always local. Charles Bridge, Bohemian sandstone, quarried within sight of the city. Pont Valentre, local Quercy limestone, from the cliffs above the river the bridge crosses. Old London Bridge, Kentish ragstone, from the same quarries that built the Tower of London. Local stone has been weathering on local hillsides through the same freeze-thaw cycles the bridge will face. By the time the masons cut it, it has already proven it can survive its own climate. Second, the build itself was the cure. Charles Bridge took 45 years, Pont Valentre took 70, Old London Bridge took 33. Lime mortar carbonates by absorbing carbon dioxide from the air for years to centuries, getting harder as it ages. By the time the last voussoir was set on Charles Bridge in 1402, the mortar in the first piers laid in 1357 had been carbonating for 45 years. The bridge opened to traffic with its oldest joints already nearly half a century into their hardening. Third, the supply chain was a closed loop. The stone came from a quarry the masons could walk to. The lime came from a kiln the same monastery had been firing for 200 years. The timber for the cofferdams came from a forest that fed the same cathedral lodge. The seventh and final layer was redundancy, and it was the one that turned everything before it into a system that could survive its own failures. The genius of the medieval stone bridge is that it is not one bridge. It is a row of independent arches, each carrying its own load. When the great Vltava flood of September 1890 tore through Prague, 3 arches at the Malá Strana, end of Charles Bridge, collapsed and washed downstream. The remaining 13 arches stayed put. The damaged section was rebuilt over the next 2 years using largely period-faithful stone and lime. The bridge never closed completely. Pedestrians kept crossing. This redundancy is built into the geometry. Each arch transmits its load to the 2 piers on either side of it, and each pier sits on its own foundation. The arches do not depend on each other. They are neighbours, not partners. If one collapses, the next one stands. Pont Valentre is the same. Old London Bridge was the same. The Pont Saint-Bénézet at Avignon lost 18 of its 22 arches over the centuries, most to repeated Rhone floods, with the catastrophic 1669 flood marking the end of its working life. The 4 remaining arches still cantilever out into the Rhone today, supporting the chapel of St. Nicholas, where St. Bénézet was originally entombed, on top of one of the surviving piers. The bridges still stand because they were never meant to be replaced, and that is exactly why they work. Medieval bridge builders understood something that modern infrastructure engineers spend entire careers trying to model in finite element software, that a structure built to last 600 years cannot be designed by an actuary calculating a 50-year service life. The best stone is the one that has already survived its own climate. The best mortar is the one that gets stronger every century it stands. And the best bridge is the one whose every arch can stand alone. Subscribe and let's keep digging up what they buried. Tell us in the comments which medieval bridge you've walked across. Until next time, build to last.